agreement between Israel and Egypt was reached on October 24, 1973. The separation of forces agreement was signed with Egypt on January 13, 1974, which the sides agreed to observe the ceasefire, made arrangements for the reduction of forces, and established the Second UN Emergency Force, UNEF, in the demilitarized zone. Israeli forces withdrew to a distance of 20 kilometers east of the Suez Canal, and the Egyptian army withdrew most of its forces to the west of the canal. This resulted in momentary peace in the Middle East.
Camp David Accords, accompanied by their capable negotiation terms and with their respective interests in mind, the Israeli and Egyptian leaders converged on Camp David for 13 days of tense and dramatic negotiations from September 5th to the 17th, 1978. By all accounts, Carter's relentless drive to achieve peace and his reluctance to allow the two men to leave without reaching an agreement are what played the decisive roles in the success of the talks. Numerous times, both the Egyptian and Israeli leaders wanted to scrap negotiations only to be lured back into the process by personal appeals from Carter. Consequently, the 13 days marking the Camp David Accords were considered as a success, partly due to Carter's admirable determination in obtaining an Israeli-Egyptian agreement. It resulted in Egypt recognizing Israel in return for re-obtaining their occupied land, making Egypt the first Arab nation to recognize Israel.
SALT II was a controversial experiment of negotiations between Jimmy Carter and Leonid Brezhnev from 1977 to 1979 between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which sought to curtail the manufacture of strategic nuclear weapons. It was a continuation of the progress made during the SALT I talks led by the representatives from both countries. SALT II was the first nuclear arms treaty which assumed real reductions in strategic forces to 2,250 of all categories of delivery vehicles on both sides. An agreement to limit strategic launches was reached in Vienna on June 18, 1979. It was signed by Leonid Brezhnev and President of the United States Jimmy Carter. 6 months after signing, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and in September of the same year, the Soviet Combat Brigade deployed to Cuba was discovered. In light of these developments, the treaty was never formally ratified by the United States Senate. Its terms were, nonetheless, honored by both sides until 1986, when the Reagan administration withdrew from SALT II after accusing the Soviets of violating the pact, thus worsening USSR and United States relations.
The Panama Canal Treaty laid out a timetable for the transfer of the canal, leading to a complete handover of all the lands and buildings in the canal area to Panama. The most immediate consequence of this treaty was that the Canal Zone, as an entity, ceased to exist on October 1st, 1979. The final phase of the treaty was completed on December 31st, 1999. On this date, the United States relinquished control of the Panama Canal and all the areas it had been in the Panama Canal Zone. This helped strengthen the United States-Panama relations.
The Iran hostage crisis was a diplomatic crisis between Iran and the United States. 52 U.S. citizens were held hostage for 444 days from November 4th, 1979 to January 20th, 1981, after a group of Islamic students and militants took over the embassy of the United States in support of the Iranian Revolution. The episode reached a climax when, after failed attempts to negotiate a release, the United States military attempted a rescue operation, Operation Eagle Claw, on April 24th, 1980, which resulted in a failed mission, the destruction of 2 aircraft, and the death of 8 American servicemen and 1 Iranian civilian. It ended with the signing of the Algiers Accord in Algeria on January 19th, 1981. The hostages were formally released in the United States custody the following day, just minutes after the new American President Ronald Reagan was sworn in. The energy shortage occurred because of worldwide oil shortage. Nations around the world started to conserve their non-renewable oil supplies in hopes to have some still available in the near future. Nations started to depend on the Middle East for oil because of their sheer abundance of it. During this oil shortage, the Arab and the Israeli states had a war called the Yom Kippur War. The Arabs would lose because the West had helped out the Israelis. Due to this, out of frustration, the Arabs put an oil embargo on the West called the Arab Oil Embargo. The participants were some of the world's largest oil producers such as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait. The gas prices would skyrocket, quadruple even. This devastated the Western economy, including the American economy. This would lead to the Americas having stagflation. Stagflation is a word used to describe a period with a high rate of inflation combined with an economic recession. This would bring the U.S. gas prices to go from 35 cents a gallon in the beginning of 1970 to around 90 cents near the end of the 1970s. The embargo would end less than a year later in March of 1974, but the effects would stay till the end of the century. The inflation of the 1970s was terrible. There was a mix of high demand and low supply of things such as jobs, houses, cars, etc. The reason for this high inflation was because no one wanted to take office as the Federal Reserve Chairman. Also, many people underestimated the effects of the inflation problem. No one really had a mandate to stop the inflation either. So what happened was that the prices kept on rising and rising. Another thing that caused inflation was that the investors and creditors had no confidence in the banking system. The lack of credibility and commitment caused inflation to rise. Another reason for the poor economy was the high unemployment. The high unemployment was the result of the women workforce in combination of returning soldiers from Vietnam. In 1869, the employment was around 80 million workers. By the end of the 70s, it was more than 96 million workers. This was an increase of 16 million more workers. It went from 3.3% unemployment to around 8% unemployment, nearly reaching another depression.